My mother's voice was shaking when she said it, and for one terrible second, I actually considered saying yes. Renee, please. Just say you were driving. Nobody has to know it was Paige. She has no idea what she's actually asking me to do. She has no idea who she's asking. I stood in my kitchen in Madison, phone pressed hard against my ear, staring at a stack of case files I couldn't tell my own mother existed, and I understood, in that exact moment, that the life I'd spent 11 years carefully keeping separate from my family was about to collide with it whether I was ready or not. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories about family secrets, unexpected justice, and moments when people finally face the consequences of their choices, make sure you subscribe to StorySpark. And stay with me, because what happened next changed this family forever. To understand why that request felt less like a favor and more like a threat to everything I'd built, you need to understand something about my family nobody in it fully understands about me. My name is Renee Colby. I grew up in Wausau, Wisconsin, the younger of two daughters in a house where my sister Paige's dreams always seemed to take up more oxygen than mine ever did. Paige was reckless in the specific way families sometimes find charming in one child and terrifying in another. She dropped out of 2 different colleges, cycled through jobs and boyfriends with the same restless energy, and somehow, every single time, my parents found a way to explain it as ambition instead of instability. I was the quiet one. The reliable one. The daughter my parents assumed, without ever quite asking, had settled into something steady and unremarkable. A lawyer, they thought, working somewhere in Madison, the kind of career you mention briefly at holiday dinners before the conversation naturally drifts back to whatever crisis Paige was currently living through. They never asked the follow-up questions. I never offered the answers. Somewhere along the way, that silence became easier than the alternative. What my parents didn't know, what almost nobody in my family knew, except my husband, Marcus, and a handful of colleagues who'd known me before the appointment, was that 4 years earlier, at 38, I'd been confirmed as a United States District Judge for the Western District of Wisconsin. A federal judge. The word alone would have changed every single dinner conversation this family has had for the last 4 years, if I'd ever let it. I kept it quiet for reasons that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with the particular exhaustion of being the family member nobody expects much from. I'd watched, for over a decade, how differently my parents treated accomplishment depending on which daughter it belonged to. When Paige finally finished a certification program in her late 20s, my mother threw a dinner party. When I made partner track at my old firm years earlier, my father asked, distractedly, whether that meant more hours away from visiting home. I stopped announcing things. It was easier than watching them not quite land. There was a professional reason too, one I understood better than most people would. Federal judges are expected to maintain a certain distance from public entanglements, a careful separation between their private lives and any appearance of using their position for personal advantage. The less my extended family knew about what I actually did, the less risk there was of any of it ever becoming a complication in a courtroom. I never imagined the complication would come from inside my own family instead. Marcus used to ask me, gently, whether I planned to tell them eventually. I always said someday. Someday kept arriving and passing without ever quite becoming today. The call came on a Thursday evening in April, 9:40 at night, my mother's name lighting up my phone screen in a way that immediately told me something was wrong. She never called that late unless it was. "Mom, what's happening?" "It's Paige," she said, and I could hear something frantic underneath her voice, barely controlled. "There was an accident. She hit someone. A man, walking near the intersection on Grand Avenue. He's at the hospital, Renee. It's bad. Hit someone. A pedestrian. This is already so much bigger than a fender bender. Is Paige okay? Is the man going to be all right?" "Paige is fine physically," my mother said. "The man, they don't know yet. He's in surgery. Renee, listen to me, this is important. The police are going to want to talk to her, and Paige she'd had a few drinks earlier. Not a lot, but enough that if it comes up, there it is." "Mom," I said carefully, "what exactly are you asking me?" The silence on the line stretched long enough that I already understood the answer before she said it out loud. Renee, please. Just say you were driving. Nobody has to know it was Paige. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, the same table where I sometimes reviewed sentencing memoranda late at night after Marcus had gone to bed, and I felt the full weight of what my mother had just asked settle into my chest. She wants me to lie to the police about a hit and run involving a man who might not survive surgery. She wants me to commit obstruction of justice, potentially a felony, and she's asking like it's the same as covering for a curfew violation. Mom, I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, do you understand what you're asking me to do? I'm asking you to protect your sister, she said, her voice rising now, sharper, more desperate. That's what family does, Renee. You've always been the strong one. The steady one. You can handle something like this so much better than she can. She doesn't know what I actually do for a living. She has no idea the specific catastrophic way that request could destroy everything I've spent 11 years building. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the table, feeling 11 years of careful, deliberate silence about my own life collapse into a single impossible moment. Mom, I said quietly, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not going to tell the police I was driving that car. And there's something about my life you don't know yet that's about to make this conversation a lot more complicated than you think it is. My mother's voice, when she finally spoke again, had gone very small. What are you talking about, Renee? What's going on with you? I looked down at my own hands, steady in a way that surprised even me, and understood that whatever I said next was about to change every single conversation my family and I ever had again. Mom, I said, I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. I didn't tell her everything that night. I couldn't, not over the phone, not while Paige was somewhere in the background, not while a man's condition still hung uncertain in a hospital surgical unit 20 minutes from where my sister had left him bleeding on the pavement. One thing at a time. Get through tonight. The rest comes later. I can't explain it fully right now, I told my mother. But I need you to understand something. What you're asking me to do isn't just risky. It's not something I can do, for reasons that go far beyond just not wanting to lie to a police officer. Please, for tonight, just focus on getting Paige a lawyer. A real one. Not me pretending to be something I'm not. She didn't understand. I could hear that clearly, confusion tangled up with her fear for Paige, and I hung up that night without fully resolving anything, my chest tight with a particular ache of watching a decade of careful boundaries start to crack open all at once. I drove to Wausau the next morning instead of going into Chambers, calling my clerk to reschedule what I could and quietly, carefully arranging coverage for what I couldn't. I want to be honest about something. Even in the middle of a genuine family crisis, some disciplined part of my brain was already calculating the professional exposure of every decision I made that weekend, the same careful risk assessment I'd trained myself to run on every case that crossed my bench. I can support my family without compromising anything. Those two things have to stay separate, no matter how impossible that feels right now. I found Paige at my parents' kitchen table when I arrived, pale, shaking, staring at a cup of coffee she clearly hadn't touched. She looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her since we were kids, not her usual bravado, but something closer to genuine terror. Renee, she said, Mom told me what she asked you to do. I told her not to. I swear I told her that wasn't fair to ask you. Maybe she did. That doesn't make the situation any less dangerous. Tell me what actually happened, I said, sitting down across from her. All of it. Not the version you've been rehearsing for the police. The story came out slowly, in pieces, the way difficult truths usually do. Paige had been at a work event that evening, 2 drinks over about 3 hours. Not, by her own account, drunk in any obvious sense, but enough that she was scared of what a blood alcohol test might show if she was tested too far outside the timeline. She'd been checking a text message at a red light, glanced up too late, and the man, a 52-year-old contractor named Gerald Owusu, crossing legally in the crosswalk, was already in her path by the time she reacted. A distracted driving accident with alcohol involved and a pedestrian critically injured. This isn't a situation any family lie is going to make safer for anyone, including Paige. Is there a witness? I asked. Someone in the crosswalk with him, Paige said. An older woman. She saw the whole thing. She's already given a statement, which means the physical description of the driver is already part of the record. A false statement about who was driving isn't just risky. It's almost certainly going to unravel on its own. There's also a traffic camera at that intersection, I said slowly, watching her face. Do you understand that, Paige? If there's footage, it will show exactly who was behind the wheel. Her face went white. Mom didn't think about that. Mom wasn't thinking about evidence. She was thinking about protecting you the only way she's ever known how, by asking someone else to absorb the consequences instead. If you were in her position, would you protect your sister, or tell the truth no matter what it cost your family? Tell me what you would do in the comments. And if you're invested in this story, subscribe to Story Spark, because the next revelation changes everything. My father found me alone in the backyard that afternoon, quieter than my mother, carrying his own version of the same fear in a different shape. Your mother's not a bad person, Renee, he said. She's terrified. Paige has made mistakes before, and your mother's always believed you were strong enough to absorb things the rest of us couldn't. Strong enough to absorb a felony obstruction charge. She has no idea what she's actually asking, because she has no idea what my life actually looks like. Dad, I said carefully, I need you to help me get Paige a real attorney today. Not tomorrow. Today. And I need everyone in this family to understand that lying to the police about who was driving isn't protecting her. It's the single most dangerous thing anyone in this family could do right now. He studied me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. You sound very sure of that. More sure than I'd expect from someone who works in insurance law. He still thinks I work in insurance law. 11 years, and that's the story that stuck. Dad, I said quietly. I don't work in insurance law. I haven't for a long time. There's something I need to tell this entire family, and I think it needs to happen tonight, before the situation gets any more complicated than it already is. The investigation moved faster than any of us expected. By Saturday morning, a detective named Ruiz called the house directly, requesting formal statements from both Paige and, unexpectedly, from me. A witness list compiled from the accident scene apparently included a note about a family member who'd arrived shortly afterward, and standard procedure required confirming exactly who had and hadn't been present. This is exactly the situation my mother's plan would have collapsed within hours. A formal statement, cross-referenced against camera footage and an eyewitness account, from someone who wasn't even at the scene when it happened. I sat with Paige while she gave her statement, insisting, over my mother's continued objections, that she tell Detective Ruiz the complete truth, the drinks, the text message, all of it, with her newly retained attorney present to guide her through exactly what she was and wasn't required to disclose. This is what actually protects her. Not a lie that collapses the moment someone pulls camera footage. The truth, told carefully, with real legal counsel guiding every word. Detective Ruiz, reviewing the timeline with careful, practiced patience, glanced up at one point during my own brief statement, studying my face with an expression I recognized immediately, not suspicion but recognition. Judge Colby, he said slowly. I didn't realize, you're the judge from the federal courthouse downtown. I testified in front of you in a case 2 years ago. I didn't put it together until just now. The room went completely silent. My mother's coffee cup froze halfway to her mouth. My father's face shifted through confusion into something closer to shock. Paige stared at me like she was seeing a stranger sitting in her sister's chair. Judge? My mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. Renee, what is he talking about? I looked around the kitchen at every stunned face in that room, understanding that the moment I delayed for 11 years had finally, unavoidably, arrived. I think, I said quietly, it's time I told this family the truth about what I actually do. I asked Detective Ruiz for a few minutes alone with my family before we continued, and to his credit, he stepped outside without hesitation, giving us the space this conversation clearly needed. No more delaying this. No more someday. I'm a United States District Judge, I said, looking at each of them in turn. My mother, still frozen with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth, my father processing something slowly behind careful eyes, Paige staring at me like she'd never actually seen me before. I was confirmed 4 years ago, for the Western District of Wisconsin. I've been sitting on the federal bench in Madison this entire time. Say the rest. All of it. There's no version of this conversation where half the truth is enough anymore. I didn't tell any of you, I continued, because for a long time it felt easier not to. This family has a way of noticing Paige's accomplishments loudly and mine quietly, and somewhere along the way, I stopped correcting the assumption that I was doing something ordinary. There were professional reasons, too. Judges are expected to keep a certain distance from entanglements. That could create even the appearance of using their position improperly. The less this family knew, the safer that boundary felt. My mother set her coffee cup down with a shaking hand. A federal judge, she said slowly, like she was testing whether the words made any more sense out loud than they had in her head. Renee, you're a federal judge, and you let me ask you to lie to the police about a hit and run. She's starting to understand exactly how dangerous her request actually was. You didn't know what you were asking, I said. I understand that. But Mom, I need you to understand now, clearly, why what you asked wasn't possible. Not because I didn't want to protect Paige, but because a federal judge lying to police about a criminal investigation isn't a family favor. It's an obstruction of justice. It could have ended my career, resulted in criminal charges against me, and made Paige's actual legal situation dramatically worse once the lie inevitably unraveled. My father spoke for the first time since the revelation, his voice quiet, careful. Why didn't you ever tell us? All this time, Renee. 4 years. Because you never asked. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting you to. Because I got used to this family not asking follow-up questions about my life, I said, and I watched that land on both of them, heavier than I expected it to. I'm not saying that entirely to blame either of you. I made choices too. I could have told you at any point over the last 4 years, and I didn't. But I think it's worth naming honestly. I stopped sharing big things about my life because I'd learned, over a long time, that they didn't always get received the way Paige's did. Paige sat very still through most of this, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. I never knew that's how you felt, she said. I always just thought you were private. I didn't realize it was because of me. It wasn't only because of you, I said. It was because of a pattern this whole family fell into, without any one person meaning to build it. But Paige, right now, the most important thing isn't sorting out 4 years of family history. It's making sure you handle the next several weeks correctly, with real legal counsel, telling the complete truth about what happened that night. This is the part where I have to be careful. I can support her as her sister. I cannot, under any circumstances, involve myself in the actual legal proceedings. I need to be very clear about something, I continued, looking at all 3 of them. I cannot and will not have any involvement in your case, Paige. Not informally, not through any contacts, not in any way that could be seen as using my position to influence the outcome. I'll help you find excellent legal counsel. I'll support you through this as your sister. But the moment I try to affect how this case proceeds, I become part of the exact kind of corruption the law exists to prevent. Do you understand why that has to be true, even now, even for you? Paige nodded slowly, tears finally falling. I understand. I don't like it, but I understand. What happened over the following months unfolded the way real consequences usually do, slower and more complicated than any single dramatic conversation, but ultimately fair in a way that mattered more than speed. Gerald Owusu survived his surgery, though his recovery took the better part of a year, complicated by a shattered hip and months of physical therapy. Paige was charged with reckless driving and driving under the influence at a level just above the legal threshold. Serious charges, though not the more severe felony counts that a documented cover-up attempt would almost certainly have triggered. Her attorney negotiated a plea agreement that included license suspension, mandatory alcohol education, a substantial fine, and a personal restitution arrangement with Gerald that Paige, to her credit, took seriously and completed without complaint. She's facing real consequences. Not the version of consequences a lie would have deferred and then multiplied. I recused myself from any proceeding even remotely connected to the case, disclosed the personal relationship formally through proper judicial channels, and made absolutely certain that nothing about Paige's legal process moved through any door I might have been able to open, even accidentally. My mother and I had a longer conversation a few weeks later, sitting on my parents' back porch on a warm May evening, the kind of conversation we should have had years earlier about a dozen different things. "I keep thinking about what could have happened," she said quietly. "If you'd actually said yes. If Ruiz hadn't recognized you. I could have destroyed your entire career trying to protect Paige from consequences she needed to face anyway." She's not wrong. It really could have gone that way, if a dozen small things had landed differently. "I know you were scared," I said. "I understand why you asked. I don't think you're a bad mother for panicking in an emergency and reaching for the fastest solution you could imagine. But Mom, I need you to understand something going forward. Protecting family and enabling family aren't the same thing. What you were actually offering Paige wasn't protection. It was a shortcut around consequences that were always going to catch up with her eventually, just in a much more damaging form." She was quiet for a long time before she answered. "I think I've spent so many years managing crises around Paige that I stopped thinking clearly about what actually helps her, versus what just makes the immediate fear go away." "That's honest. That's more honest than I expected tonight. And Renee," she continued, "I owe you an apology for something bigger than that phone call. I think I spent years not really seeing you, because you never demanded to be seen the way Paige did. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth, and I think you deserve to hear me say it plainly. I still keep parts of my professional life private, even now. Some habits built over 11 years don't dissolve overnight, and there are still genuine, legitimate reasons a judge maintains careful boundaries around her personal life. But my family knows the truth now, all of it, and something has shifted permanently in how we talk to each other because of it. Paige calls me sometimes now, not in crisis, just to talk. A habit neither of us had built much of over the years before that April night. She finished her alcohol education program, kept her restitution payments current, and told me recently, quietly, that she thinks about Gerald Owusu almost every day, not out of guilt performed for anyone else's benefit, but because she actually understands, now, what her choices that night nearly cost someone else permanently. That's a real change. Not the kind that happens because a lie got covered up successfully. The kind that happens because consequences were allowed to do the work they're supposed to do. My mother still occasionally slips and describes my work vaguely to distant relatives, old habits taking longer to unlearn than 4 months of honesty can fully erase. But she says, federal judge now, plainly, when it matters, without the careful protective vagueness she used to reach for automatically. I think about that phone call sometimes, late at night, the particular fear in my mother's voice when she said the words that could have ended everything I'd built. I understand now that she wasn't asking me to become someone dishonest. She was asking me to disappear into a role she'd always unconsciously expected me to play, the reliable one, the one who absorbs whatever the family needs to absorb, so long as it kept everyone else from having to face something difficult. I finally stopped playing that role. Not because I stopped loving my family, but because I finally understood that loving them honestly meant refusing to disappear for them anymore. If this story made you think about what you would do when your family asks you to choose between loyalty and the truth, tell me in the comments. Would you have done what she did? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Story Spark for more powerful stories about family, secrets, justice, and unexpected consequences. And remember, sometimes the hardest person to stand up to is the person who taught you that family comes first.